Hi, good evening, everybody. My name's Linda Somerville. I'm the Deputy General Secretary here at the STUC. We've waited a couple of minutes on people to join us, and I know some people are still joining online, just as they maybe get home from work, get organised, and get themselves ready to join us. So I just wanted to say for this evening a huge thank you for joining us online. We've arranged this event this evening for a variety of reasons. It's part of our ongoing work, our anti-racist work. We held a conference for community leaders, trade unionists and activists last year on building anti-racist workplaces. We've continued to do work throughout the year, but this particular event is being hosted at a really, really critical time. Just a month ago, we all heard the absolutely shocking news of the murder of 3 children in Southport. And whilst the families of those involved in the wider community began to just, how could you possibly begin to process those tragic events? None of them could have been prepared for really what happened next. And throughout our TV screens, our phones, we all watched on, and in some places, depending on where you lived, in England and Wales and in Ireland, actually on your streets, you watched on in horror as a series of attacks on mosques, homes in the street, hotels, housing asylum seekers unfolded before us. These were not protests. These were not people with legitimate concerns, as was often being touted and being put forward as the case. We need to be really, really clear, and at the STUC we were, and we've said it again and again, and we'll continue to, on behalf of Scotland's trade unionists, that we know what these were. These were violent, racist and Islamophobic assaults and riots on people in our communities and on ourselves, on trade unionists. So while some commentators, said that this had come out of nowhere, we didn't agree with that either. Campaigners, anti-racist campaigners, those involved in the refugee and asylum support system, and trade unions, and many people who are politically active said, we're not surprised by this. We're shocked by it, but we're not surprised it's come at this time. What we've had in Britain is we've continually warned that the drip feed of racist language that we've had from Westminster, from many of the leaders of organisations and political parties, has become mainstream in our newspapers. The media leaves these rhetoric around migration unchallenged. It's always presented in a negative light. We don't talk about how we can narrate migration as an important and positive thing for our economy. And that's really assisted by the unscrupulous and uncensored social media misinformation that's out there, which in this case we can examine in quite a lot of detail, was a huge part of what happened and could happen again in this situation. But if you overlay all of that with decades of austerity, which has meant cuts in public spending, cuts in public services, whether that's the NHS, affordable housing, then the result of that really is the makings of violent riots, and that's what we saw. But what I'd like to do, as well as rather than dwell on that and those scenes, I just wanted us to refresh and remind ourselves of how that had come about. But I'd rather we actually talked about what happened in the unfolding days. In the days and weeks beyond that, we saw some of the most heartening scenes that probably many of us have seen, which was where mosques opened their doors, indeed sometimes to those that had been banging them down, where volunteers came to sweep the streets, to build walls, to bring tea and support and solidarity in whatever way that they could. And when tens of thousands of people in towns and cities got together to say that wasn't in our name and came out in support and solidarity of their communities and to defend their communities. And it's that resistance and that response that I think gives us both hope and optimism, but also resets the balance about those scenes and says that, really what we saw there was not typical of what is people's reaction. Now, whilst we didn't have any of that situation in Scotland, we would be naive to think that we were immune from it. There's a bit of a fallacy around, radical Scotland, in the same ways there are around certain cities potentially in England. And yet actually we're not immune from that. What we want to do tonight with our guests, and we've got an excellent lineup of speakers for tonight, is to begin to look at and explore how we can build on that resistance and that resilience in our communities and build a movement with trade unionists and what their important part is in this, why trade unions are involved, but also begin to examine some of the origins of this, where there has been examples of self-organising in the past, where communities have come together to stand up for themselves. What's worked? Sometimes the lessons learned that haven't worked, and we need to be quite frank about them. So that's some of the things we want to explore this evening. As I say, we've got 3 excellent speakers with us to do that, and we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. So first of all, I would like to welcome to speak to us tonight is Taj Ali, who many of you will know. And Taj Ali is the co-editor of Tribune magazine and has written widely about the experiences of Asians in Britain and talking about, and would like to address some of that tonight, looking at some of that history, but also what can we learn from it in terms of trade unions. So I'll pass over to you now, Taj. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. And firstly, I just want to say thank you to the Scottish Trade Union Congress for taking the initiative to set up this important conversation. I have never been prouder to be a member of a trade union, and I think the support and the effort put in by trade unionists across the country to defend mosques and temples and refugee centres has been truly heartwarming. There's lots to learn from the past. There's lots to learn from the past few weeks. And I think, there are several factors at play that led to the riots. We, of course, had the trigger factor, which was misinformation around the Southport attack, that terrible tragedy that was exploited by the far right. We've also seen an atmosphere of hate in this country for decades, actually. The demonization of migrants, the demonization of Muslims, the moral panic around certain communities not integrating into society, that immigration is out of control. And we really saw that ramping up, particularly after Israel started bombing Gaza. We had Suella Braverman talking about hate marches on the street when we saw peaceful protesters marching in support of Palestine. And that made people like Nigel Farage comfortable to then therefore go out and say that British Muslims don't have British values, right? And so suddenly we had the moral panic coming up again around Islamists taking over the country. And unfortunately, Labour and Tory politicians played into this narrative, and it put communities at risk. And so as much as we have to talk about people like Tommy Robinson and Elon Musk and social media misinformation, we also have to look at what's been happening in our political discourse. What have our politicians been saying? What have our newspapers been saying? And I think the trade union movement has to articulate a vision that brings communities together, that does not appease the far right narrative around migration, because as much as we do that, the far right will always have a deeper narrative around migration. They will always be even more anti-migrant than we are. And I think one of the historic failures of the trade union movement and the left has sometimes been that we haven't been vocal enough against racism. We should be unapologetic in calling it out. The rioting took place in some of the most deprived parts of the country. In the 10 most deprived parts of the country, we saw far-right riots in 7 of them. And if you look at the Reform Party vote in the election and prior to Nigel Farage even becoming leader, when you look at the polling, the far right were polling well in post-industrial towns, in former mining communities, in former coastal communities and former seaside towns. And all of these areas have severe economic issues. And the far right tapped into that narrative of resentment, this sense of despair, this sense that things are not getting any better for us. And the divisive narrative that you're helping those people, but you're not helping us. And so for a very long time in this country, when we've talked about class, right, we often said the white working class, as if Black and Asian people can't be working class and are distant from the working class, despite the fact that, as we know, many Black and Asian people are disproportionately working class. When you look at the history of migration in this country, after so many years of colonial rule, these were the people working in the factories, the mills and the foundries, often had very little support in housing, very little support in the workplace. And it was because of that lack of support that South Asians and Black communities organized for themselves. You had the Indian Workers Association in many of these workplaces fighting for their rights. You also saw with the second generation in the 70s and 80s, anti-racist movements were set up to tackle the far-right threat. And again, you see the parallels with today. So we had people like Enoch Powell talking about the rivers of blood. You had front page headlines from The Sun talking about an invasion. And that was what empowered the racists. That's when we saw an increase in racist attacks. And when I speak to those involved in the fight against racism, they would always talk about the narrative, the media narrative, the hostile environment that was created. And they were forced to organize for themselves. And I think when we look at the far right threat today, it's quite different from the 80s. We now have more established ethnic minority communities. I come from Luton. Luton is one of the most diverse parts of the country. It's also where Tommy Robinson's from. And many of the people on the front line against Tommy Robinson were white working class people who rejected his narrative because they grew up around us. They went to the same schools as us. They studied in the same workplaces as us. And we had many, many issues in our town. But we united to try and tackle those issues. And people like Tommy Robinson were never around trying to find solutions. And we saw off the EDL in Luton in 2011, and we never had any sort of far-right threat here. We had some incidents of racist hate crime against hijab-wearing women, often done in the early hours of the morning. But it was nothing compared to what we were seeing in Sunderland and Hartlepool and Hull. And these are areas where the ethnic minority communities are very small in number. And so from my perspective, what I saw happening in the Northeast and in parts of Merseyside and in Belfast mirrored what was happening in the 80s, where racists felt emboldened to say the P word, where hijab-wearing women were spat at, where, you know, unfortunately, we saw the most horrific scenes in Rotherham, where they were trying to do an arson attack on a centre housing refugees, a hotel housing refugees. And these people felt emboldened to do that. There was this atmosphere of hate. They saw attacks in Southport and they started to mimic them. And there was a very quick response. So communities across the country set up WhatsApp groups to mobilize, to monitor any far-right threats. So in Luton, because there was a lot of misinformation around the far-right threat, we were seeing posters about the far-right going everywhere. There was a lot of misinformation, and the BNP used to do this back in the day to rile us up and to try and get Black and Asian communities in trouble, right? And we were trying to verify that information. And as a precaution, we set up a WhatsApp group in every postcode area of Luton. We monitored the neighbouring town of Dunstable because we thought that that was where they used to have quite a strong far-right presence. And there was a huge turnout of anti-racists in places like Walthamstow in London, right? But that wasn't where the far right was strong. The far right was strong in areas where the minority communities were small in number. And I think this is one of the key lessons to take away from what's happened is we need to develop links and we need to build links in these communities. In Middlesbrough, you know, we saw some horrific rioting where residential buildings, windows were getting smashed. And the mosques organized their own self-defense of businesses and the local community. And they were very clear that they were just there to do self-defense and nothing further. But it's often very, very difficult to control the reaction when things are very, very heated. And I have to say the level of fear in Black and Asian communities, I've never seen anything like it. My mum was absolutely terrified. My sisters were absolutely terrified. They all wear the headscarf and they're all more likely to be targets of far-right attacks. A lot of people closed their businesses. There was a couple in Bishop Auckland who said to me, one of them said to me, his wife was having panic attacks and he was shutting the shop down because he was absolutely fearful. And people don't talk about the mental health impact, the trauma, having to relive the trauma of what you might have experienced in the 80s. You know, when I was growing up, my dad would always say that racism will always be there, that people will always see you a particular way. And we started to develop the mindset that racism's not in your face anymore, that it's institutionalized. And unfortunately, the events of the past few weeks have demonstrated that that is far from the case. You know, if you look at what was happening in November, we saw a 600% increase in Islamophobic hate crime. And that got very little attention in the media. Nobody was paying attention to this. Even now, when we look at racist hate crime against minority communities, the police are often characterizing it as antisocial behavior, low-level crime, and not taking action. And this is what I've been hearing from people in places like South Wales, in Newport, where a Muslim woman was spat at, and the police never really did enough. And so, you know, the response from the government to the riots has been strong prosecutions, and I think that's a very, very limited response because we've not dealt with the atmosphere of hate created. The reality is many of the people rioting were children. They were children who'd been radicalized by the far right. As much as you had a neo-Nazi element, and we were monitoring some of them in Telegram chats, you had Patriotic Alternative, you had former supporters of Tommy Robinson and the EDL. You also had working class boys in particular who'd been radicalized. And I think as much as we're talking about the far right, we're also talking about the alt-right, the people like Andrew Tate, for instance, who has basically radicalized young boys and fed them this narrative that liberalism's out of control, that men can't be men anymore. And there is that aspect, a gender aspect as well. I went back to my former high school. I went to a high school that was predominantly Black and Asian, and all the boys were listening to Andrew Tate. They were all fans of Andrew Tate. And this is the problem that I don't think the left has got to grips with, that we have the wrong role models in our communities. The reality is the trade union movement is nowhere near as strong as it was in the 80s. The vast majority of working class people are not in a union. And as much as we should encourage people to join a union and do the political education, we also need to build links in communities. And I think there are some great initiatives out there. The Fans Supporting Food Banks initiative in Merseyside that spread across the country. You know, these were the places where the far right were trying to recruit, and it's certainly what Tommy Robinson was doing back in the day with football fans. And so having a presence on the football terraces, doing work in communities, engaging and listening, because as much as there are people who have done the most horrific things, there are also people who've been led astray, who can be won back over. And I think if you look at the voter base of the far right, many of them support what the trade union movement supports. They support higher taxes on the wealthiest. They support decent pay rises. They support nationalizing key industries. But they've been led astray on numerous other issues. And so I think it's very, very important that as much as we organize self-defense and monitor the far right threat, we also need to provide an alternative narrative. And I think the trade union movement is very well placed to do that in the workplace, but also liaising with local mosques, local temples. And, you know, we're speaking to people in Middlesbrough at the moment. There's a youth worker there and there's someone involved with one of the mosques. And we're proposing an event in one of the community centres where we have a discussion and we make it about working class unity, that as much as we're talking about anti-racism, we're also addressing material concerns. We're addressing things around housing, we're addressing things around pay. You know, many of the people involved may have been self-employed. So what message does the trade union movement have for those people who are outside the union structures? And I think, you know, when we look at what the unions have done in the past few weeks, in particular the RMT union, Mick Lynch was very clear and used his platform to push a message of anti-racism and working class unity. He also sent a circular to all his members, urging them, when it was very heated, to go out and protect mosques and refugee centres and temples and places of worship. The Fire Brigades Union, they were members of the FBU who were out protecting a mosque in Southend. The CWU Union sent out a circular as well, and I thought that was fantastic. And, you know, within the trade union movement, historically, we have had a problem with racism. In fact, I, as an industrial correspondent, met people who grew up in racist households who told me that they had unlearned the racism that they were fed and that they had interacted with the wider trade union movement, and through political education, their minds had been changed. There are still members of trade unions in Britain today, and indeed in Scotland, who voted for the Reform Party, who might sympathise with some of their views. And I think we have to address that as well. So as much as we focus on the bread and butter issues and fight for decent pay rises, we have to have the political aspect of trade union organising as well. And just to look back at some of the organizing that the Asian youth movements did in the 80s, as much as it was organized self-defense and monitoring, they also had the politics as well. They also saw themselves, as much as they organized as South Asians, they saw themselves as part of a broader working class movement. Indeed, many of them were involved in the miners' strike. They weren't miners, but they saw the connection with the working class, and they would go to Orgreave and stand in solidarity with the miners because they knew what police brutality was like, and they understood what community meant. And I speak to former miners and the wives of miners in places in South Wales where they've never met a Black or Asian person in their lives, and they remember that solidarity to this very day. And so there are beautiful examples in the history of the movement of communities coming together. And I think that's the message we have to push. There can be problems sometimes with the way we tackle racism. Sometimes people think it's far easier to go into a community you're not from, to call people fascists, and to go home and pat yourself on the shoulder. And I think that's a serious problem, because the problem hasn't gone away. The minority communities in that area don't feel any safer. So as much as we have to sometimes take a stand and defend ourselves physically, we also have to try and win people over. And I don't see that in any way as softening our politics or giving in to far-right narratives. I think we have a very compelling narrative around working class unity. Whether you live in Birmingham or Luton or Bradford or Sunderland or Belfast or Hull, the material issues are often similar around housing, around the cost of living, and that's the link we have to make. So I think the best thing I think that the trade union movement can do, number one, we need to be present in communities and liaising with the mosques and other, institutions in these places. But number two, we need to just set up dialogue, even if that's a simple thing of booking out a community center and just having a discussion. I have found through discussion that it's so easy to find similarities with people. And just to share a story before I end, when I was at Warwick, I lived in Coventry, and I was coming back from a university lecture, and there was 3 big white skinheads behind me. And I thought, oh no, here we go. But my prejudice came into my head. 3 big skinheads, there's going to be some trouble. And one of them said, started talking to me, how you doing? You're right. And one of them said, what you're doing? And I said, I'm a student at Warwick. I'm studying history and politics. And I talked to them about some of the modules I was studying. And one of them said, for a working class idiot like me, mate, what does any of that mean? And I stopped him and I said, you're not an idiot because you're working class. My dad worked in the Vauxhall factory. My dad's a taxi driver. He's one of the smartest people I know. And I'm sure you have better understanding of the world than many of the posh private school kids that I study with. And we bonded over this shared experience of being working class, right? And then at the end of the conversation, one of them said, your sound, mate, don't let the Marxist professors brainwash you. And I had to laugh because I thought he's probably a Marxist, right? But those people could possibly vote for reform, or they could possibly vote for Labour. And my point is, people are complicated. People won't always have the right views. People might not be the most politically correct. And we need to have a level of understanding that we are trying to win people over. That should be the purpose of trade unionists. It's about winning, right? It's about convincing people to join your struggle and to win for your members and for your communities. And I think we have to approach anti-racism in the same way. It's a collective struggle. It's not about purity politics. It's not about feeling better about ourselves because we're more progressive than anyone else. It's about ensuring communities feel safe, that we feel better off as people, and we're bringing people together. And I think those should be the defining principles of anti-racism.
Thank you, Taj. Thanks for all of those insights and for putting all that together. There's a lot to unpack in there. There's a couple of things I just wanted to reflect on quickly. I mean, one of the strong things that comes out of the presentation that you've just made is really about division and therefore how you build beyond that, and talking about both trade unions being in communities and who are trade unionists. They're people. We talk about trade unionists as if there's some group of people at work, and then once they go home, they're no longer trade unionists. We are trade unionists, we live in houses, we have neighbours, so we are in communities. There's often people think, I'm a trade unionist, how do I take part in my community? What does that look like? It's like, you live there, it is where you're at. So whether there's issues around you like closure of local schools, whether there's closure of facilities, whether there's something going on and you're involved, then that is you building those community links. And I think sometimes when we label things as community organising or trade union activity, people don't see that they're actually the same person that could be doing those things. So even just breaking down some of what does that look like, how do I become involved in my community, it's really just, it's not about going out and finding a group that's self-organised and then you join it. It's often just about what you might do in your community. And also you talked about winning people over, and I think there's some lessons for us all in how we go about doing that, because all too often when people have the facts and the figures and the research and the knowledge, they might want to impart that in a way that might be felt as condescending or patronising to people that don't have that information or aren't open to that information. And I think there's something there about how we go about doing what may be political education work, or indeed trying to break down some of the myths, particularly about migration, about asylum and refugee process, and how those things work. There's a really small example just after the riots when one of the presenters was interviewing two older women in a community, two white women who took part in a local community centre, and they said they were quite frightened to share their own concerns because they thought they'd be labelled as racist. And one of their concerns was her son couldn't get a job, and everyone else she met, asylum seekers, could get jobs. And when the presenter of the programme, just in conversation, said, "You do know that asylum seekers are not allowed to work?" She said, "No, I didn't know that." So that came through a conversation and not somebody presenting her with a series of facts. So I think there is your idea about dialogue and how you speak to people about what the issues are rather than lecture them is really important. And I think we have to take that on board when we look to kind of dispel some of the myths. We can think we're going about it in the right way, but it can be quite condescending, I think, for how that lands with people who might be fearful that their own answers are not adequate in that space, There was part of it as well about thinking about how we're present in communities and how that changes our own experience. And I think looking at the political education side of it, and that brings us on, to our next speaker particularly. So tonight we've got with us Sean Byers, and Sean's from Trademark in Belfast. And the work that they've done in Ireland is something that I think we should all pay more attention to. There's lots of lessons. If you don't know about Trademark, check them out. They have a podcast, which I would definitely recommend, and we'll put links up to that in the chat at the end. And they do a lot of work in exploring difference in communities, obviously based on some of the anti-sectarian work that they've done, but beyond that, working with trade unions and identifying some of the work that we've just referred to around, are there racists in our trade unions? We'd be naive to think there weren't. How do we go about tackling that? So I'm going to ask Sean to give us a chat about the work that Trademark's done and really why it's important for us to learn from that. What lessons can we take away? Over to you, Sean.
Thanks a lot, Linda, and thanks for the plug for the podcast. And thanks a lot to the STUC for the invitation to take part in this event. It's a really important one, and I hope we're able to build from here and have more of these type of exchanges. I want to begin by giving a wee bit of background on Trademark and the work that we do, if only for the benefit of people who might not be familiar with us. So we do have our roots in the trade union movement, and particularly its response to the legacy of conflict and sectarian division in the north of Ireland here. We really started out as a trade union firefighting service, you might call it, to deal with incidents of sectarian harassment and intimidation in the workplace, but also as they spilled over into the community. And there was a lot of that back in the 1990s and the early 2000s as the peace process was bedding in, really. There's not as much of it anymore, but we still do get the odd call. Over time, the organisation really evolved and to take on a much broader focus on post-conflict transformation in its entirety, including the economic dimensions of it, the political dimensions, the wider legacy issues, the role of armed groups and communities. And we also segued into cooperative development and political education, particularly in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And one of the reasons we got involved in political education is people are coming to us, people we work with are coming to us for answers about what just happened, whether it happened again, what are the implications of this. And we quickly discovered that there wasn't a wild lot of political education being done on the island of Ireland, so we threw ourselves into it and we've been doing it since. We've always played a role in tackling racism and the far right as a natural extension of our interventions in workplaces and communities. And that work has obviously expanded as it has become more of a mainstream problem, as racism has eclipsed sectarianism in terms of the challenge it poses, in terms of the number of incidents we see on a day-to-day basis. And that's some feat in a society that is defined by sectarianism. And it's also grown as the new Irish nationalist far right has emerged or re-emerged alongside the more established strains of far right thought to be found within sections of Ulster loyalism. So we're doing that work on the far right in Ireland and internationally now, like including with a range of trade unions, and trade union federations and social movements across Europe, and including the TUC in London. So that's a background to us. And thanks for posting the link, Francis. I thought it'd be useful to maybe provide some context of what's been happening in the North before looking at the role of trade unions. So there are a lot of things that resonate with what Taj has said, but obviously we have our own particular context to speak to. Established minority groups in the North have been experiencing harassment, discrimination, low-level violence for decades. And obviously that does resonate with what's happening in Britain. I think you can point to the experience of the Indigenous Irish traveller community, for example, here, which has been on the receiving end of horrific racist treatment, even at an institutional state level for decades, if not a century. Also the experience of the established Indian and Chinese communities. But the levels of racism and racist violence have really increased massively since the early 2000s. As Northern Ireland has become slightly more diverse in terms of ethnic background, and as minority groups have been increasingly scapegoated for deteriorating socioeconomic conditions. So there is that parallel in terms of the impact of austerity. The first big spike in racist attacks came at the height of the austerity period and then continued to simmer under the surface. We're talking about 2012 to 2015, so pre-Brexit, but then they continued to simmer in the build up to the most recent outbreak of violence. One of the main challenges we have, and this is something that has to be raised, even though it's difficult. One of the main challenges that we have is that the majority of attacks appear to be concentrated mainly in working class unionist towns outside of Belfast and working class unionist parts of Belfast. So how do you explain that without appearing to be sectarian or giving the wrong impression? There are a few factors that are worth mentioning. So in the first place, a high proportion of new arrivals tend to be housed in these working class unionist areas due to the availability of cheap rental accommodation, which obviously has made those people a more visible target, a more visible and isolated target for scapegoating. These are places where there are huge issues of deprivation and disinvestment, where there's a devastating legacy of industrial decline, where there's huge anger and resentment about the Good Friday Agreement and how that has panned out. There's a very strong perception in loyalist communities that over the past 25 years, they've been abandoned or shafted by the state, and that they've lost out in every term or every way imaginable, economic, cultural, political. And I think that sort of corresponds with maybe some of the sentiments that you see being invoked by the protesters and rioters in English towns where we've seen the violence. One of the main reasons that these feelings of resentment and anger have been allowed to fester and then develop in an outwardly racist direction is the lack of political leadership, as in Britain. And the more hardline of unionist political representatives are too often found to be equivocating on the issue of racism, or even repeating far-right talking points. And you find some of them occupy the political space where you might expect to find a reform-style party. So it's an ideological problem, but it's also the work of cynical politicians who are keen to deflect the blame on the migrants for their failures to deliver for the people they claim to represent. And then, of course, all of these problems are compounded by the continued strength of loyalist paramilitaries in some areas. And we have to understand loyalism as a highly decentralized and fragmented phenomenon that operates in different localities independent of any sort of central leadership or direction. So in some areas, that's where these loyalist paramilitaries are having their influence felt. They're only too willing to encourage or orchestrate attacks on minorities, be that to satisfy their own racist impulses or as a way of sort of exerting control in the community. And like in England, the way young people have been manipulated by far-right elements, there's an army of young, impressionable, working class lads in these areas who have no hope for the future and are being encouraged by people with influence and control to go out and engage in this violence. So that's a real challenge. Now we only need to look at what's happening south of the border in parts of Dublin and elsewhere to know that this isn't a problem confined to unionist communities. But I think in the context of the North, we have to recognise that there are particular conditions which help to explain the patterns of violence and which make it more difficult to organise an effective anti-racist response in some places. So this sort of brings me to the trade union movement in a roundabout way and the role it has to play. So I'd say the experience of coming through the conflict has equipped the movement with some of the tools and given it some of the standing among the public that's needed to deal with some of these questions. So the approach of the official trade union movement and its affiliates, I'm generalizing here, but the approach of the trade union movement and its affiliates during the conflict was to keep the focus on economic issues that united the working class, to promote the message of class unity. And then later, it gradually took a more proactive role to mobilize public support for a lasting and viable peace agreement. And using that approach, or on the basis of that approach, it was able to achieve what was a minor miracle in keeping its membership united. There were points in the conflict when it looked like the movement was going to fall apart or it was going to lose large proportion of its members. But it managed to keep its membership largely united and intact, while providing an outlet for bread and butter politics, for sort of bread and butter politics. And I think that was important at the time for those who felt that they didn't have a political home in the darkest days of the Troubles. And so the trade unions have continued to play this role in the post-conflict era. And they've demonstrated an ability to mobilize large numbers, not only in times of industrial unrest, but also mobilizing the wider community against austerity, against the privatization of water, on housing issues, on other single issues, and in opposition to racism and the far right. And we were glad to see the ICTU sponsor and lead a demonstration of 15,000 people on the streets of Belfast to give a voice to the majority who stand opposed to racist narratives and far-right organising in the city. So the trade union movement has provided civic leadership. It's acted as a rallying point for a particular kind of united front politics, and we're seeing all sorts of new relationships. Just like Taj has said, all sorts of new relationships, anti-racist networks emerging alongside the solidarity rallies. And trade unionists are to be found at the front and centre of these. Now, there are still huge challenges to building an effective trade union response. there's the practical challenge of building links in communities, of ensuring that trade union solidarity reaches the places where it's most needed. The communities where these problems are most concentrated and where minority groups are most vulnerable are those where trade unions are the weakest. And they're also the places, as I've said, where you have the paramilitaries to contend with. So the ICTU or the trade unions can call a rally in the city centre, which is neutral ground, neutral and relatively safe ground these days. But it can't necessarily have a public display or a march of solidarity in loyalist parts of South Belfast without risking a major sectarian confrontation and without making things worse for the people who are on the receiving end of these attacks. So in these cases, it's alternative routes to solidarity have to be found. Like, it often involves, and it is involving behind closed doors engagement and dialogue with those affected. It's involving dialogue and engagement with community organisations on the ground. And I think we're seeing a recognition of the need for trade unions to be organised around a broader suite of material issues, including those that are flashpoint issues, the likes of housing, for example. And the trade unions have an important role to play there, but other forms of independent working class organisation, the likes of tenant unions, have a really important role to play here. And I'd like to mention CATU, which is the sister organisation of the different tenants unions in Britain, which has been doing a sterling job in the aftermath of the recent attacks in terms of bringing the community together, in terms of organising across the community and across the working class on the issue of housing. So I think those interventions are really important. I'm getting to a close here, but the main longer term challenge we have is a very fragile form of class unity that exists among workers here, which is still a segregated society. And that unity is maintained in part by keeping politics out of the workplace and out of the trade union movement. So there's a logic to this, of course, in terms of not wanting to split the membership by declaring a position on a controversial issue, but also raises questions of how you then create and build a politicised membership and a politicised movement, and particularly one that sees itself as an agent of transformative change. So obviously from our perspective and from our experience, we would argue that there needs to be a greater emphasis on political education as one tool for addressing this challenge. The conclusion we've reached, and I'm sure many others have reached, and I know colleagues within the STUC are working on this, understand and explain basic questions of political economy, so they can have challenging conversations with their workmates, their friends, their family members, their neighbours, about the nature of the system, how it's set up, who it benefits, and how. So they can direct people to the root causes of the problems they're experiencing, and even so they can tell a more positive story about migration. And in years gone by, that was a role that was performed really effectively by shop stewards. It's something we used to do really well. And I know there's some brilliant political education being done in pockets of our respective movements, including within the STUC. But I think we need to get to a position of it where it's mainstream. And it's once again a core part of what the trade union movement does. So look, I think there are some lessons. Hopefully there are some lessons to be drawn from our experience, but I think we have as much to learn from what's going on elsewhere. And that's why these types of exchanges are really important. So I'll leave it there, maybe.
Thank you very much. And I mean, that was fascinating. And, you know, when we think about the different layers that people are trying to combat and work within, taking on the perspective in Northern Ireland and thinking of the sectarian, historical, and even now still very much geographical and other divides that there are, you're having to navigate as trade unions, and indeed anti-racists are having to navigate through that takes on a whole new layer of nuance that, you know, we don't have to think about. So, you know, sharing that is really, really important. And I think the work that you have done is so credible about thinking about how do we look at political education as what is the political economy, how do we explain that to workers? And that's what I meant about it not being patronising or condescending, because sometimes people can feel that they are being spoken to around that rather than understood to that exchange of information where they actually hold the answers themselves. So the work that you have done around that is excellent, and there certainly is learning for us all. So thank you for sharing that. I was struck by a couple of things that you talked about, and again, thinking about working class unity, how do we build that, the lack of resources in a community, whether it's housing, whether it's, you know, access to NHS facilities or other things. These are consistent themes that keep coming up, and what we saw with the riots in Britain is layered, and, you know, Taj explained it really well, that if you can layer that on top of the demographic of the most deprived communities in the UK that came, or in England, I think it maybe was, that these events happened, and could have happened anywhere, but that tells a story in itself, whether it's industrial, post-industrial areas, whether it's areas that have had been deprived for a long time of the type of work that there is, and there's huge parts of Scotland that can happen in. And I think also because of the UK government's displacement, you now have asylum seekers that have no opportunity to actually build any networks or local solidarity, because they are moved and housed and moved, and they can't ever begin to form roots within a community anyway. So that isolation that community has, and then sometimes they're put in a very rural area, which has its own challenges anyway. So we've got lots of different things going on there that just add to this. In terms of trade union response, I mean, we have had some really, you know, we've reached out, as you both pointed out, it's about speaking to people and making that dialogue. When the riots happened, the STUC put out a statement. We also wrote to the Muslim Council of Scotland offering our support and solidarity on behalf of Scotland's trade union movement. And I know some local trade union groups have done that as well. I know I just saw a response yesterday from the Central Mosque in Edinburgh, when they had written back to the Edinburgh Trade Union Council, which is our kind of local trade unionists coming together, where they'd often offered their support and solidarity to the Edinburgh Mosque, and they'd had a really positive response. I know that Dumfries and Galloway Trade Union Council at the moment is leafleting and using the local press really creatively as well to talk about the more positive role that they have, and that they try to support asylum seekers who are living locally, and to counter some of the far-right leafleting that there's been in that area, and that's quite a rural area. So again, a bit different, the dynamics there as well. So trade unions, whether it's through their workplaces or branches, or indeed geographically, are often really involved in trying to take this work forward. And one area where we had a very visible presence for about a year on the ground was in Erskine in Scotland. And there was a group of asylum seekers that were housed in a hotel there, and they had fraternal links really with the community until some people from the Patriotic Alternative and Homeland and whatever they called themselves the next week turned up and began to build some opposition around that. And what happened was both the local trades councils and people from the wider area decided to have a very visible presence as the far-right presence grew week on week. And that continued for over a year, every single week. And there was a variety of responses to that, and Taj touched on it earlier. You know, do you mobilise? Do we bring people to an area and say, let's have a big protest and then leave again? And does that change the dynamic, and how does that empower local anti-racist campaigners? Or how does it disempower a local community? There's a question there that's a wider question to answer. What do we do about organising locally, and whose responsibility is that? Who's best placed to do that? And I would certainly argue that particularly in the smaller communities, the last thing people want is lots of people from outside coming, unless they ask for it. It's about listening to people. And I know some of the faith groups in Scotland in the immediate aftermath of the riots down south said, we don't want a group of 50 trade unionists turning up at our door. Well-meaning as it is, right now we don't want that. So we had to listen to that and say, you know, we'll wait until it's the timing is right. So I think opening that dialogue, but being very listening, because we don't have all the answers, and our reaction to sometimes do something might not be the right one. But coming back to Erskine, I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, and who has been taken a role in leading both the trade union and community response, supporting the Trades Council locally. We had a couple of trades councils involved around Erskine, Paisley Trades Council particularly, and Cheryl was involved in that. She's a PCS member and a member of the STUC Black Workers Committee. And Cheryl's response to that was a very humane response, a political response and a trade union response. And I'd like Cheryl to tell us a bit more about what that solidarity looked like in practice. Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Linda. My God, what? Can't believe I'm at the end. Not what. I hope everyone is just ready to strap in and listen to a bit about Erskine. I have a slide that I have. But I have a lot more reflection. Did I just stop sharing? Yes, I did. Come back and share. That's the ticket. I thought I'd give you a bit of background first, because probably not everyone might, I know all about it, but not everyone does. I think it began over COVID. Asylum seekers and refugees were being housed in hotels. There's people that know a lot more about the inner workings of that kind of community. So, things like the Mary Hill Integration Network, please do follow them if you can. They're on, social media and things like that. But yeah, I guess I came in a bit later on in the Erskine year of protests. But before I did start taking part, it just feels like when the announcement was made, I think it was only about 40 asylum seekers and refugees were due to be housed in this hotel. It's quite dilapidated. I think it was close to being knocked down, to be honest. And when that was announced, I think there was kind of local racists, maybe just citizens concerned about this happening. I think there was a kind of a public meeting where it does sound like things weren't great and things did go a bit sour. And then in February 2022, Erskine demonstrations kind of began. It started with kind of, I guess, Facebook is the cause of all the issues, but it was kind of soft racists kind of were like, oh, we don't want them here, plan a protest. A far right group who were at the time Patriotic Alternative, they kind of caught wind and got offered their support, I suppose. I think that was initially kind of rejected, but then I guess the groups all merged. Once Patriotic Alternative were, discovered to be involved, it doesn't take that long to realise these are a bunch of fascists. So they their own Sunday demo, which the locals didn't originally take part in, they changed their mind. The 5th of February came. I think I've heard it was about 100 racists came. Patriotic Alternative came and brought banners and placards and scaffolding to make a podium. I've seen photos. It looks scary. But thankfully, on the other side, there was about 200 anti-racist and activists giving just as good as they got. There was also police presence. Patriotic Alternative PA announced that they'd be there every week. The counter demos basically continued every Sunday for over a year to oppose them. About 95% of the time, the anti-racists outnumbered the racists. There was a big one on the 22nd of May 2022, and that was kind of supported by also the STUC coaches were set up to bring people over from Glasgow and Edinburgh. And I think that brought down the racists from about 100, maybe less, down to about a 20 core solid group of hate. Bless their souls. I call them just misguided. But I think it got to May, changing weather. That's really great. I think after the big one, it turned the environment, I guess, into a more welcoming environment. The demos changed, I think, from being more of it was for a kind of a standoff with people shouting at each other, and then it just became welcoming and friendlier. People were playing sports, and the refugees would come out the hotel and play football. And I started going in about June. And I think by that point it ended in basically kind of two groups of people largely ignoring each other, which is also an effective way of frustrating someone if you don't really acknowledge their weaponness. My reflection on the whole thing is what I'm going to talk more about. The experience was super transformative. At the beginning, I heard about Erskine and I thought, I'll leave that one to the white folks, not one for me, that. But then I thought, if it was me, if it was my mum, if it was someone in that hotel, I would want as many people on my side as possible. And then, you hear about things through word of mouth, but then actually going and seeing for yourself what it's like. And, I saw that the racists were on their own little sad bit of grass. There was the police in the middle, and then we were on the larger bit of grass, and we had the big tree for shade, and we had sunshine and things. When I was going, there would be about 20 to 80 people on our side, maximum of 20 on theirs. Sometimes they brought along teddies and prams to bulk up their numbers, but we had actual people, so we were better. My very, very first Erskine, I brought along a friend because I thought I can't do this all by myself. They grew up in the area as well, which helped. Brought along a croquet set, frisbee. There was a barbecue that day as well, and just mingling and chatting in the lovely sunny weather was definitely not what I was expecting when I heard about how Erskine could be. And what was super, super sweet, I have an Indian carom board. It's like really hurts your fingers, but you pop all these things into like pockets at the side, and you don't, even without speaking the same language, we'd had some very intense matches of carom, and it was really that was lovely kind of community building in its own way. And at the end, the asylum seekers and refugees would plug their phone into our speaker. We'd just do a big dance off and even dance the dabka. I really look back, like that was just a happiness that we created on that field. And I do describe that event, going to Erskine, as a kind of a picket line against hate. Like when we are all standing together and just hate's on the other side, we just give it joy. And I'm glad I did go along. There's kind of like things I also just think about is solidarity really doesn't have any limits at all. Like you don't actually need to, speak the same language or anything. You can just, if they recognize our PCS flags, I'm a PCS member, they recognize our trade union flags, this and that. And it is quite telling that on the other side, all they had was like countries' flags. They would have a US flag or something. And I was like, okay, clearly that's an odd bit of branding, but that's probably all they have. And another thing is obviously trade unions and social justice very much do go hand in hand. Another campaign that people might know of is a Sheku Bayo campaign, that when things are just wrong, I look at trade unions to get us into the right state of play in terms of work and also societally. One thing I'm so chuffed about is I really think, and maybe I've not got the knowledge to back this up, but I really believe that our mobilisations and our continued efforts has hopefully demonstrated, that people power is great, and similar mobilisation, that's a horrible word. Similar stuff that could have happened didn't, and like I think that was a big kind of a demonstration that just solidarity is great. And it's not, you don't have to be you can be me, you can be someone who doesn't look like me. We can all be together, people of all ages and genders and races and socioeconomic status. We really have the power, and I feel that's a hope that is important to have. And there isn't definitely not a single mold of activist that we should all try to be like. That's something I'm really trying to reckon with. There's some anti-racist people who wouldn't mind, if they saw someone walking over, they just go straight there. And I'm like, I'm just going to hang back. And I will, just hang out with my Google Translate, trying to ask people about their countries and not what life was like. And all forms of kind of activism is great, and that's really something that I'm cementing in my mind. And really, really sweetly, I know Suki is in this call, but over the recent May Day events this year, a wonderful, further cementing of how great activism is. Taj, hearing you speak at our May Day rally, at the same time, Channel 4, Defiance was on there. And basically, I didn't really correlate the two, that people from a South Asian background like myself have this rich history of fighting racism and fascism. Literally never learned that in school. Probably the teachers were scared, but I always thought of my culture of being kind of, good food and beautiful clothes and just kind people. And I do proudly include anti-fascist in there too, which I think I will always promote. And in general, like, you know, it's never, I am preaching to the converted, but obviously it's never been more important to be anti-racist or anti-fascist. Particularly when I think about Erskine, some of those people, some of the racists there, they had jobs, you know, Monday comes and they don't stop being racist. They, bless them, you know, still have things to do. And I do find it interesting that hate can start off kind of small. Perhaps these people had these thoughts in their minds, and then it grew, and you know, what became internal becomes external, and it grows, and we got crappy media. And you know, then the next thing that they're on the field just shouting at people with banners saying things like "deport, not support," which, God, is just so sad. And I feel like one of the things we used to say all the time was like, yeah, the problems aren't these lot, is kind of the wider society and its austerity. And, you know, division is always, you know, if the real issues are, you know, our energies could have been better spent if we were all kind of uniting against, you know, the powers that be, rather than some of the most marginalized people in our society. I honestly also do believe there's probably racists out there who think, oh, no, it's not about race. I know of one person of colour, I'm not racist. And maybe they think they're helping society, but bless them, I don't think that's true. And in general, it's always good to change your mind if you're presented with quality, reputable information. And I really think unions can be the vessel to provide the information, even if it's something small, popping a poster up or something, hosting talks. There's so many anti-racist links and podcasts and books, and even courses some unions have. And okay, it's not going to be like, oh, Tommy Robinson has come to my challenging racism course, so obviously he stopped. But it can be enough to normalize. If you normalize anti-racism enough, that can be enough to not allow it to take root in the first place. And I'm speaking as a kind of a rep. Everything is obviously driven by members. You know, the STUC isn't just STUC, it's kind of all of us here. And yeah, of course, we have to be sure not to burn ourselves out. But, you know, if you build your branch and you build your activist base, that does share the load. We've got members who are in tenants unions who are so quick to be like, oh, can we, you know, we'll just share things and we'll help each other out. And you know, people are in community groups, people do go to church, they're not just a union member and that's it, they're, you know, religious or this and that. And yeah, it's not just like the activists of the union, it's the members. We all knew this. Then what do I have here? When I talk about Erskine, there's a kind of famous saying, be nervous and do it anyway, which I definitely was. I made sure I brought along a friend with me or two or more. But really, I really I would have regretted not being there than going. And I'm glad I did go, I guess. Recently, I was so happy to attend this PCS Proud event we had with Ray Goodspeed, who was one of the original members of Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners. And at the time, he was linking Palestinian causes to LGBT causes. People are out there probably saying, oh, you know, gay people are persecuted in Palestine, so how can you support that and how can you prevent that? But sometimes the cause is so just that you have to support it regardless, and that can really be applied to any movement. If we don't want racism and hate in our society, it's not going to happen just like that. People do need to be active, and I guess you already knew that anyway. Then my next kind of point. Oh, yeah. The issues in work. You know, capitalism, we see things like the profits reigning supreme, inflation, you know, going up, but our bills going up and our food prices going up. Companies reporting such high profits, but our salaries definitely do not increase by remotely the same amount. That is a kind of perfect disaster recipe there. And it will always be convenient for the media, for other people to blame people that don't look or sound like us, or maybe have a lower socioeconomic status. Apparently, we're all bleeding the country dry. We never really see that language used for CEOs and, you know, politicians maybe who are helping themselves to bonuses and tax breaks. So yeah, so sad that people blame people that aren't really responsible. Coming back to Erskine, at the time there was probably, you know, the 20 hardcore racists, probably outnumbered by 80 or so anti-racists. There's a population of about 15,000 in Erskine. You know, there's probably loads of people in there who disagree with the racist, but they prefer to stay quiet and they don't want to be visible. That can be scaled up not outside of Erskine, it can be scaled up countrywide. You know, visible union activism can bring out the quieter anti-racists who can then empower other quiet anti-racists, and you know, the cycle can continue. Racism can be, you know, minimized and reduced, and really that this kind of world does benefit everybody. Recently, when it was the riots, when in August, early August, I was abroad at the time. I'm from Bolton. That's where this voice is from. I was fearful for my friends and family back there. One of the things that I have tried to find news online, but it wasn't there. It was on the day in town near Card Factory where there was a big mobilization of the racists there. There was machetes bandied around, and like the police were there just kind of stewarding them. And I think there was also a counter protest at the same time. I've got a friend who was just there, just seeing everything, crying and telling people to go back home and get safe and things. So these are just kind of the real things. It's not just a news thing. It's in our like streets. I landed from a trip on the Friday in the midnight, and then 5 p.m. that same day, I went over to Paisley. There was an anti-racist demonstration there. Also at a hotel where some refugees and asylum seekers are housed. We did our thing. We had music, speeches at the end, a kind of just mingling and chatting. And there was refugees who were housed they were sitting at the window, and they held up signs saying "thank you." And I thought, oh my God, when will we ever get this kind of, you know, feeling of love, I guess. But then that was my first day in the UK, and I remember I gave bravado, but I was so nervous, and I was like, how the hell am I going to get back to my car? I asked random people there, can you just walk with me? And the next day we had Glasgow's kind of a rally there too, where people in my branch came along. Someone came for the very first time, age 33, never been to a demo before, and they thought this was just too important not to go to. And it was just really kind of, yeah, instilling hope after seeing, you know, I think we were 2,000 people. I think just 2 races came up. So that was super, yeah, instilling the hope that I had lost while I was doom scrolling abroad. And yeah, it's the last wide thing, I guess, is, you know, obviously trade unions and trade councils are so important to be at the movement. We always stand with the oppressed, which I think is just a wonderful thing that I always say to every new person that I come across at work. The far right, they don't just hate, you know, ethnic people or refugees or anything. They link up with other parties to spread their hate, and they protest trans rights or even workers sometimes. And, you know, I do feel sorry for them eventually, you know, mostly. They don't really have the solidarity that we do. But yeah, that doesn't mean we put them away and do shout at them, even though it's the easiest thing to do is to be like, Nazis off our streets. But that's only very superficial. It's not very long lasting, and turning people away. It also does damage things potentially in the greater run too. That was the end of my kind of blethering there. So thank you so much for your time, all. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was very much a really quick pit stop round all of the work that happened by a whole load of people, different organisations, trade unions, trades councils, and anti-racist organisations who supported the work that was being done in Erskine. And we did learn a lot from that. And for me, I think the end point of that I was, you know, really said a lot. And, you know, I will give some credit to Scottish Government because they do use a different language around describing migration and the need for migration in Scotland, looking at the demographic, looking at the changing demographic, why we need people to work in Scotland, and to come and join, you know, and be part of this population. So they do have a slightly different narrative about it. And I think one of the most heartening things was when, I think at your suggestion, Cheryl, we supported some of the asylum seekers from Erskine to travel to our St Andrew's Day March and Rally, where they came along and they led the march and rally. They sat in at the rally and heard from, at the time, our First Minister, Humza Yousaf, and at the end they all went down and got selfies taken with them. And I just thought, you know, when you think of their journey, most of these young men and where they'd come from, to suddenly be standing with the First Minister getting their photos taken, you know, was really quite incredible for us, a very practical and really quite weird, but practical, or you know, way of showing how welcome that they actually were here, you know. So yeah, and I also just think you've shown that, you know, the left does have all the best songs in terms of describing what happened on those picket lines, as you called them, against hate. It's about being a trusted voice. You know, what is that trusted voice? And it comes back to something that Taj said as well earlier about, you know, we're not understanding how much influence that some people as online commentators and influencers, they call themselves, have on parts of our community. And, you know, we've mentioned Andrew Tate a couple of times this evening. One of the organisations I'm involved in is the Inclusive Education Organisation in Scotland. It's an LGBT plus organisation that works across schools, and they've noticed a significant change in their work in schools since COVID, particularly around the narrative that they're getting back from young boys that are saying that they've been doing some work with them around what is their language and where do they get their influence, and they're doing some research now, much more it's kind of formal research around it. But all of these young boys are now reporting that they're much more likely to believe what someone like Andrew Tate tells them than either their parents or their teachers. So where is the credible voice that we can put forward alternatives when we're faced with that type of thing? Now, I think some of that will ride its time, and some of these things will be, change anyway, but we have to make sure that we can be in the places to give the credible voice. And as you say, and I think Sean brought out in his comments as well, unions have often filled that role when times are tough, when there's crisis, when there's communities divided. People turn to, obviously, sometimes trade unions and say, that's where I can get good, reliable information. And that information doesn't have to be a lecture. That information can be, as you said, a link to a podcast, watch this television programme, have you thought of it in this way? It can be a bit of a discussion. I mean, a huge thanks to our speakers. We've still got a bit of time left. We've got a few questions that we were submitted earlier that I just wanted to ask briefly. We can maybe get a quick response from you about that and see if there's any others. I say we do want to finish at 8 o'clock sharp at the latest. And there's a few closing remarks that we want to make. But I was just going to ask, Taj, particularly, you've done some work around this, I know, but when we think about this kind of, influencing in our communities, whether it's round about, the online influence, you talked about the children taking part in these riots, and now we're seeing young people being sentenced and given harsh sentences, and I'm not sure any of us would really support that as saying that that's going to be a helpful response to what I can understand that why the UK government have decided that this hard line they're taking in terms of sentencing is how they think they can do this. You cannot police people's attitudes. You can police a certain behaviour in response, but that's not going to change the root causes. So, for some of the really young people that were involved in this, not the, real anti-racists that did agitate and sometimes were not present but led this, how do we look to respond, and who is best to try and do that? What do you think? Should that be done online, in person, or how do we take that forward?
Well, I think the best interactions are always done in person. And if you look at the principles of trade union organising and trying to organise your workplace, you have to identify the key individuals who have clout, who people respect, who people turn to, who have the links. And when I look at how the GMB tried to organise Amazon workers in Coventry, they would find a Romanian worker, a Pakistani worker, an English worker, and they would make sure that they were organising in their parts of the warehouse. And it was that joined up approach that was really effective in mobilising large numbers in the workplace. And I think it's a similar principle when you think about organising in your community. So to give you one example, in 1995, we had riots on the Marsh Farm estate in Luton, which was a predominantly white and West Indian estate after an incident of police brutality. There was a group called the Exodus Collective who used to organise these raves on the outskirts of Luton in abandoned warehouses. And so, the rave culture and the sound system culture was quite a big deal. And on the third day of rioting, they organised a big party. And the police came down. This was the first time people had seen a helicopter on the estate. And the police said they could hear the birds whistling because all the kids had been taken off the estate and they were having a good time. I don't think it's coincidental that riots often take place in the summer when school's out and college is out. And it's this sense of having no pride in your community. Most people, white working class people, Black and Asian working, they don't want to see their own businesses smashed up. And I think what was spoken about earlier in terms of joy, using music and food and that sense of solidarity, making people feel as though they are part of something, is very, very important. And many of the people from that estate, some of them ended up becoming Salafi Islamists, right? Others became members of the EDL. But there was this memory of some of the organizers on that council estate who are involved in left-wing circles, who are involved in Luton to this very day in anti-racism, and they have clout in the community and they have respect in the community, and people have been won over. People who were, swayed towards Islamist extremism, people who were swayed towards far-right extremism, they were won over by credible people in the community. And so I think if we're going to go about organizing anti-racism in places in Merseyside or Middlesbrough, we have to allow local people to take the initiative. We should help to facilitate, but we should really liaise and engage in dialogue and ask them, who do you think is best to speak on this platform? Who do you think really understands this community? Who are these people going to listen to? And so I think that takes a bit of time sometimes to develop. We don't need to rush into action straight away. We need to study, we need to understand, and we need to monitor. And so I think that's very, very important. And so I think the trade union movement, as much as we do the organizing in the workplace, the point you made, Linda, that they're not just organizers in the workplace, they are organizers in their own community. When people were trying to organize on the Marsh Farm estate, they would knock on doors on the council estates and they would say, what do you think about this big initiative that the council is doing? What do you think about that derelict building? Maybe it's time we organized and tried to take it over for the community's benefit. And so I think the community wealth building stuff can be part of this. So it's about giving local people control, allowing them to be in charge of decision making very, very often. The worst thing you can do is to be an outsider and to just impose what you think should happen in a community that you're not from. I think we have a role to play in facilitating and bringing people together through our contacts, but local people have to be involved in anti-racism.
Thank you, Taj. That's excellent advice. And I think there's lots in there, I think, for people to both follow, understand, and find out more about, because, some of these historical events that have happened, some of the community responses have been, some of them are written up, some of them aren't, some of it's oral history, but that's why using different forms of media, whether it's podcasts and other ways, we need to document them, we need to share them and find out those lessons that we can learn. Talking about finding, safe places and people to speak to in your community, one of the questions I wanted to ask Sean about, thinking about the work in Northern Ireland, and I say it's particularly challenging and different because of what you're dealing with in terms of both the legacy and it's at times the current still sectarian divide. How do you straddle that in terms of how do you make that dialogue with individuals and groups that you might disagree with? You're trying to pull together safe spaces and hold people to account for unacceptable views, but build that unity. What have you found has worked well there?
Well, one of the consequences or legacies of the conflict, I suppose, is a strong community infrastructure that has developed in the areas most impacted by the conflict. And so originally the work that we were able to do, and we were able to go anywhere really and have those conversations or help to facilitate those conversations, that's probably the best way of putting it. First, on the back of the trade union movement being viewed as a neutral broker in a lot of respects, and that's where the trade union movement has a unique role to play in Northern Ireland. It's seen largely as a neutral broker that advocates for the whole community. So when it steps in and offers to facilitate difficult conversations between or within communities, then that can often take place, and that's how we were able to go about it in the first instance. And then, as I said, we're able to work with and through the established community infrastructure that there is in communities that, as I say, is a legacy of the conflict. And it's as a result of those conditions of the conflict that community organizations, community leaders have the sway to be able to pull people into a room and have difficult conversations, because they were used to having difficult conversations in the height of the peace process. So there's all these different factors coming together that make often create conducive conditions to having difficult conversations, because it's not new to us. We have that experience.
Okay, and that's, I mean, I think really what you're talking about there is the credibility, and that often touched mentioned there about finding people who are the authentic leaders in communities. So when people have got that credibility, then others do look to them, and I think that's really important. It comes back to some of the most basic community organising and trade union organising. When you've got key leaders, when you've got people that have got authentic voices, then people will rally to them, and it's about us trying to work with those people, and in many cases we are those people in our own communities. Thinking about the organising side of it as well, I mean, Cheryl, you gave some really good examples there about building those relationships, because organising is not about bringing people together for meetings. It's not about getting large numbers of people together. It's about ultimately about building relationships. And that's why people come back time and time again to an event, to something, because they feel something and they feel a connection. And I think that's the really important bit of that. So if you had one thing to say about how we go about building that type of relationships, what would you recommend to people if they want to do that?
Oh Lord, Linda, what question? Because sometimes it's one of the, I think, like, maybe it's easy to answer for me, but like why I started going. I remember at the beginning, I thought, oh no, Sunday at 10:40, I can't do it. I'm too tired, and I was so. It was a coincidence that I bumped into someone who I did tweet about Erskine. Hey, when is it? He came over and was like, "Oh no, people, play football and stuff like that." And I guess I heard this relationship was already there, and people weren't that. And I thought, okay, if they can go, then what am I whinging about really sleeping and being I guess you can't really tell someone to be more empathetic, but I definitely am very empathetic, and I think if it was me, I wouldn't want that, and I don't think people do that enough. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. And then yeah, again, when if it comes to building relationships with other people, God, that's a tough one because it is, it is like how do you like other people? Do people like you? People don't. Not everyone wants to, have a relationship with someone all the time. But yeah, I think putting in the grand scheme of things and thinking this is just bigger than myself right now. This is more important. Other people are struggling. I can get over my little hang-ups. If I answered a question, I don't know, but I'm glad I said something at the end.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thank you. We've had a couple other questions, but I'm not think we're going to have time for them all. So, because we've had some fantastic contributions from speakers, and I say we don't want to keep people past 8 o'clock because it's a long time to be online. So, a huge thanks to everybody. I've just got some quick closing remarks. A couple of people have actually messaged in and said, "What can I do? What do I do next?" That's another important thing. As I say, this is part of a series of both ongoing work that we do and trade unions do. I mean, there's things that people can do, I think, politically, that we're involved in politics, if you're involved in trade unions. Political lobbying is still important. We've got a whole bunch of new Labour MPs and they're all looking to make friends, so there's people that need to be held accountable, people we vote for. Credit to PCS who took legal challenges against the UK government and the Rwanda policy. So trade unions have a political voice both through legal challenges, through organising, through lobbying, but as individuals and as branches and workplaces you do as well. So I think there's a role still for political lobbying. If government and local authorities and others, councillors aren't doing what you want, we need to step up. If you know there's something, they need to step up. If there's something happening in your local area, your local councillors need to know about it and they need to say what they think about it. Sometimes they can be a bit nervous about that. If you think something's going on to do with the far right, they have to be held accountable. Monitoring the far right's not an easy job. Not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone's up for it. It can be emotionally, quite tiring, particularly for people of colour. And I think we need to be aware of that, where that emotional labour sits. when we're asking people to take that role on, but sometimes it needs to be done. What are they organising and what are they doing online? But we need to do that with care and consideration about who we put in the space to do that and make sure people are supported. Finding community campaigns that unite us is really important, whether that's around like a resource, it's around what's going on in your community. Sometimes it can be the simplest of things that people actually are agitated about, and bringing people together through their trades councils, through their work, through their communities, through other organisations. Thinking about political education, can your branch deliver that? Can you do it in your workplace? What resources do you need to do it, and who's got them? We've got some resources that we've put together previously. Hope Not Hate, I'm sure many of you will know about their work. They've got fantastic resources online. I would recommend them to check them out. We can put a link to that in the chat as well. And thinking about framing the language about immigration, not as a negative, but actually something to be really welcomed. You know, there are in places in Scotland and across the UK, people have a history of migration. You know, people are quite happy to talk about their families migrating, but sometimes not about how they feel about people migrating here. So we have to think about that as well, and think, how do we actually frame that? You know, as very other things that people can do with immediate kind of action. People can think about, you know, what can you do? You can join an anti-raids group. You know, there are anti-raids groups that some of them have stalls, they have events, they often, as well as responding, obviously, if there's raids in their areas. So think about what they do, training as well. So think about, do you want to join an anti-raids group and what that would look like? Also, some of the asylum and refugee groups that are out there and the organisations, they need volunteers. They need people also to come along, and whether it's buddying up with asylum seekers, to go to their appointments that they have to go to volunteer to befriend them, to help them with other projects that they might want to be involved in, whether it's community projects, because they have to evidence that they've got some connections with communities, and how can they do that when they're so isolated? So think about volunteering as an individual for some of the buddying schemes, but then some of these can be very local. There can also be things that you can do collectively. Can you run sessions in your own branch or in your workplace where you can use some of the resources that are online, or you can ask refugee and asylum organisations what they need from you as a workplace? Can you run sessions about that at work? So these are some of the immediate actions that you can take to try and build some of that anti-racism language and practice in your own workplace. And to think about how we can best take this work forward, because it's not going to go away. Migration as an issue should be an issue that is discussed in UK politics in the same way as we discuss education or taxation, but it is not. It is an issue that is discussed in sometimes the most toxic form, and we've all got a role to try and change that. And the other thing that I would ask you to do is come along to the rally. There's a national rally being called as a counter-protest, and we're not sure how that's going to pan out yet, but there's a counter-protest that was called, and credit to Stand Up for Racism for taking quick action to call this, after there was suggestion that there was going to be a fascist gathering in Glasgow on the 7th of September. So the STUC and Scotland's Trade Union Movement is jointly involved in that, and we will be there and we're promoting it, and we want people to get involved in that protest to give a really loud and clear message to say that, you know, asylum seekers are welcome in Scotland, refugees are welcome in Scotland, and that the far right and Nazi organisers and and fascists are not. So we'll be there together with the trade unions across Scotland, and we would ask you to promote that in your workplaces and come along on the day and take part as well. So thanks everyone for attending tonight. I hope you found our speakers helpful. I certainly have. There's a whole load more of work for us to do. So thank you. Good night.